This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth starts the show as he discusses the pests that he is currently getting questions about, the alfalfa weevil and wheat curl mite. Scarlett Madinger, Vice President of Communications at the Kansas Livestock Association, continues today's show with how to prevent livestock theft and report it. Ending the show is K-State Extension horticulturist Cynthia Domenghini with more information on tree care as she covers mulching around young trees and providing enough water. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show with some updates on crop pests with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, anytime.
Jeff, we've talked about alfalfa weevils a few times on Agriculture Today, but it's time for another update because you're receiving some more questions.
Yes, the alfalfa weevil only occurs once a year. But that once a year is something else, and I really do not like alfalfa weevils. I never have, and most alfalfa producers in Kansas don't either. But they're about to go away. The alfalfa this year, from what I've seen and most of the growers that I've talked to, looks really good compared to the last 3 or 4 years. So I'm hoping if everything still goes right for the next week or two, by the time we get it swathed, we're going to have a pretty good first cutting. But anyway, the alfalfa weevils are still around, not causing as many problems as they have in prior years at this time. And one of the reasons is because of the weather. We've had, better weather this year with a little more rain, a little more cool temperatures than in past. That really affects alfalfa, and that really affects the alfalfa weevil. Right now, from what I've seen in the last 3 or 4 days, probably the 50 to 60% of the alfalfa weevil population is pupating. And what that means is they're not going to feed anymore. So the ones that are still there, they're pretty large, which means they're going to feed another day or two, and they're going to pupate. There are still some really small ones, but those are going to be non-consequential from here on out, I think. What you need to look for if you're out looking is the pupal case. It's it'll be either in the residue or in the canopy someplace where during the larval stage, they attach themselves to the leaf, or they crawl down the plant and get in the residue, and then they spin a little silk webbing around them. It's not like a big cocoon like you see in a butterfly, but it's just kind of a nondescript whitish, grayish webbing, and that means they're finished. They're not going to feed anymore. And then the question I get, depending upon temperatures, actually 70 to 80 degrees is the ideal temperature for alfalfa weevil development. If it gets much warmer than that, they don't like it because they're a cool weather insect, and they can get down to 50 degrees. They'll do just fine. So most of them are going to be chewing their way out of that pupal cell, and they're going to be coming out as an adult if it stays cool. Now, and I looked at the forecast for the next 10 days. It looks like it's going to be relatively warm. So I'm hoping the adults will leave the fields. They go away in the summer and over summer someplace other than the alfalfa field. Irregardless, they won't feed. Now, I say that they will feed a little bit when they first emerge from the pupal case, and that always causes concern, especially, if it's a little muddy or a little wet out and you can't get out and harvest it. The adults can stay around, and they can feed a little bit on the leaves. They'll feed on the stems, especially if it's just cut. They'll feed on the stems, and they do what we call barking, which means they eat the epidermis around the outside. They can retard its growth just a little bit, but not much. They don't eat anything like the larvae do. So I really recommend not treating the adults because they're going to be leaving, and they're not going to feed that much. A lot of times then when you swath and you put the alfalfa in windrows, you'll put these adults and whatever remaining larvae are out there right underneath. You accumulate them and put them right underneath those windrows. Then when you take the windrow, you pick that up. There's some yellow, more shorter hay or more retarded hay underneath there because the adults and the larvae have been feeding on it. A lot of times I get the question, should I spray that? Will that help? That won't help. They're just going to die. Once you get that hay up, once you get that windrow up, the adults will leave, the larvae will just die once it gets too warm. So the good news that I'm here to share with you all today is that alfalfa weevil feeding season is coming to an end. Doesn't look like it's been as bad as in previous years, and I think that's because of the weather. But also, I heard that many growers and applicators used a little more gallonage to get the insecticide down to where the weevils are, because remember, that's important. There's two things really important about treating any agricultural pest. It's timing and making sure you get the insecticide down to where the pest is, because most of these insecticides are contact insecticides, so they're not taken up by the plant. They have to be put into contact with whatever target pest it is you're looking at. So the adults are gone. They will be gone. They'll move out to the over summering, and we've sampled and tested and tried to figure out where they go in the summer. But we just can't. I don't know where they go, but they leave the field. They don't feed. They come back in September, October, and they start the process all over again. They overwinter as adults and eggs, and then they'll start in the spring because they only occur once a year, but that once a year is plenty. Trust me.
And another pest that's definitely not a fan favorite, the wheat curl mite, and what issues does it create?
Wheat curl mites, they're really, really, really tiny. You can see them without magnification, but you have to know what you're looking for, and generally there needs to be more than one there, at least for me to see them. But yes, and that's a question I get a lot from growers, can I see them without magnification? You can, but it's difficult. Now, if you go out and you're pulling volunteer plants with rolled up leaves, unroll the leaf, and oftentimes that's where they are. You'll find a whole bunch of them will fall out. I always bring them over to the back of my truck and put them in a white pan with a kind of a dark bottom on it. The wheat curl mite itself is, they're very tiny, like I said, but they're kind of an oblong or cigar shaped, and they're kind of a whitish, greenish color, depending upon if they've been feeding on the chlorophyll of the plant or not. So they fall out, and you can see them better, not on the leaf. And if there's a bunch of them, you can tell what it is. But they're feeding, they get down into the leaf, and they'll feed right along the vein. And as they do that, that causes the leaf to curl inward. So it creates a little place for them that's pretty safe, a pretty controlled environment underneath that leaf, a little tunnel created by that leaf. The thing about the wheat curl mites, as they're feeding, as the plant puts on a new leaf, they crawl up to that new leaf. So they're affecting the new leaves on the plant all the time, which is not good for the plant's growth. This year, every year we can find wheat curl mite damage, but the problem with wheat curl mite is not the damage caused by the mite itself, even though they do suck the juice out of the plant. The damage mainly is because they vector the viruses that cause wheat streak mosaic. There's 5 or 6 different viruses that get into the wheat plant. They have to be vectored by the wheat curl mite, as far as I know. And the thing about the wheat curl mite, remember, they're really, really small. They can't fly. They can't jump. They can't run. They're really small. They walk really slow or crawl really slow. So they have to be transmitted by the wind, or when one plant's leaf intermingles with another, they'll crawl across it, or they crawl across the ground and get into another plant. They're very slow. You wouldn't think they'd be able to infest the field the way they do, but this year I've seen more fields infested probably than I have since about 2016 or 2017, at least around the central part of the state. The wheat streak mosaic, the virus, it's like any virus. Once you get it, there's not much you can do about it. If we get a virus, we just treat the symptoms and hope it goes away. That's with the plant. It's not going to go away. And it's wreaking havoc on a lot of, some of the fields I've seen, they're not going to have any yield. They're going to have to be plowed under. And that's the key. Once you decide what you're going to do, let it go to yield or plowed under, you got to take into consideration the mite. The virus is going to be there. Any mites that feed on that infected plant are going to pick up that virus, and then they're going to be able to transmit it to another plant. The mite itself, generally, as far as wheat concerns, over summers, over winters, whatever, on volunteer wheat. So this year, I think a lot of growers are going to be really impacted by how important it is to control their volunteer wheat in a timely fashion. These wheat plants need to be controlled at least 2 weeks before you plant. And I mean, it needs to be controlled well, because the little mites, if you just plow the volunteer wheat under, they can live on those plants as long as there's a little bit of green there. They can stay alive quite a bit, and you get some more growth from volunteer plants. They'll move over to those, and then you go plant in the fall. They move over to your domestic planted wheat, and therefore we have a problem. So this year, I think that's something we need to talk about. We don't have a lot of really strong resistance to the virus. We don't have any strong resistance to the mite. What is, if there's some plants that are out there that the growers will say are resistant, but it's not a really good, strong resistance, and that's something we may have to look at in the next year or 2 or 3, is trying to develop some better resistance to the virus and to the mite if possible. But I think a lot of people are going to be a little bit taken aback when they go out and look at their wheat and they start looking at yields, especially in the central part of the state where I've spent a lot of time looking at wheat. Don't be surprised if you have scraggly-looking plants. And also there's some aphids out there. I just was seeing some aphids this past week. Aphids transmit barley yellow dwarf, which is another virus. So, I'm sorry to come on here and give you such good, hopeful, optimistic news, but the wheat crop is really developing right now. It's looking pretty good, but I think in the next month or so there's going to be a lot more maybe barley yellow dwarf and wheat streak mosaic showing up that some folks are not aware of right now.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we continue the show by talking with the Vice President of Communications at the Kansas Livestock Association, Scarlett Madinger, about livestock theft. Scarlett, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Scarlett, begin our discussion with why theft may be becoming more prevalent right now in the livestock industry.
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost, if anybody's been watching the cattle market, they know that cattle are of great value right now. Not that they're not always of value, but right now the markets are high. And so it could be lucrative to someone that decides to take some that are not theirs, to sell them and get a somewhat quick dollar back in return for that. So I think that's probably one of the reasons we might see it up. Like I said, I think some people see it as a quote unquote easy way to earn a dollar. By stealing cattle, they think that they can make a quick turnaround on some dollars. And right now with the market so high, it can be several dollars.
What kinds or classes of livestock are more at risk of being stolen?
Sure. So I think, right now it's more about probably what's the easiest access. So, we're just kind of coming out of calving season. So calves would probably be relatively easy to take. Sometimes bred cows or cow-calf pairs, depending on what they think they can get away with and what they think they can get loaded quickly.
What can people do to protect their livestock from theft?
Yeah, I think there's several things that producers can do to at least help prevent the theft of livestock. First and foremost, brand. Brand your cattle. That's going to be the most permanent, surefire way to positively identify those cattle. If they're trying to sell them at a regional auction market, somebody is most likely to recognize that brand, maybe know that, hey, that isn't who dropped them off. And so I think branding is number one. Also, ear notching can help. That's another permanent identifier, if you will. Ear tags can help, but they're so easily removed that they're really not a guarantee that they're going to stay, and most likely they're not. They're going to take those ear tags out. And so they can help, but they're not obviously a permanent identifier like a brand or an ear notch is. I think too, being able to restrict access to your pens, your pastures, other property as much as possible. I know that can be difficult. As a rancher out there, you may have various locations and you're in and out, and, trying to restrict access also makes it an extra step for you as a rancher to have to get out, unlock the gate, get yourself in, things like that. But anything that causes someone to take an extra step, somebody that's looking to steal cattle, if you're making them take an extra step, it serves as a deterrent. And so if you can keep those gates locked, chain your loading facilities. So if you have movable loading facilities or movable pens, chain those up so that they're not easily accessible to somebody that they can back up and load your cattle out. So make sure that that is secure, and I think also just recognizing the location of your pens, are your pens on a busy highway? Are they on a busy dirt road? Being aware of your surroundings and how easy it is to access your location. You don't want to keep your cattle penned up overnight. So say you're going to load out calves, the next morning. I understand that it helps save some time, obviously, if you can get those penned up. My family does the same thing. But if your calves are on, if that pen, it's right there on a corner where people can visibly see these calves pinned up, you might think that through so that, again, you're not making it easier for somebody to just back up and take those calves. So if you can avoid pinning them up overnight, or possibly, at least make sure it's as secure as possible if that's something that you have to do. Checking and counting your livestock frequently also is important. Keep written records if your memory's like mine, and it can be a little short-term, trouble there remembering that. Write it down, especially if you've got cattle at multiple locations. But if you're counting them regularly, then if you're missing some. And that would help narrow down when they were possibly taken. So if you keep an eye on your cattle as frequently as possible, I think will be very helpful. Also, just be observant, right? Take note of any suspicious vehicles that are in the area. Growing up in a rural community, you kind of know who belongs there and who doesn't, right? And so, especially around your pastures, who you see regularly on that dirt road when you're headed to check those cattle, and who is out of place within reason. And so if you're observant about that, then you can at least make a mental note. You're like, that's somebody I haven't seen before, or interesting vehicle, and just makes you a little bit more aware of who's in your neighborhood. And, as KLA member, we have a theft reward program. We have reward signs that our members can hang up on their fence. Again, just another little deterrent that says, hey, these guys are proactive and they're a member of KLA, and we can help them take some steps, if they have cattle stolen. So, hanging any kind of sign up that's a deterrent may be helpful as well. So that's just several things that producers can think through as they're trying to make sure their cattle are protected from any kind of thief.
Scarlett, what should producers do directly after a suspected theft?
Yeah, so what we recommend is, first and foremost, call your county sheriff. If you know that you have had a theft, contact your county sheriff so that they can come out as quick as possible and take down any details that you have. The second call, we believe, should be to the Kansas Department of Agriculture, Division of Animal Health, because they have the ability to send information about stolen livestock to auction markets around the state and also other points of sale. So they can get a quick note out to them. Of course, if you're a KLA member, you can obviously call here to the KLA office, and we will institute our reward program and send information out from our place as well.
So, Scarlett, a local sheriff's office, the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and the Kansas Livestock Association, all agencies that handle reported thefts?
Yes, absolutely. We recommend all of those. Anytime a member calls our office to say that they have had some cattle stolen, that's the first questions we ask them. Have you contacted your sheriff? Have you contacted the Kansas Department of Agriculture? So that everybody can be on the same page and trying to get that information out.
What does a typical search radius look like for stolen livestock?
I think it varies depending on where you are. I think most folks that are going to steal your livestock probably aren't going to go to the closest auction market, right, to sell them. So you're going to want to broaden that radius out. Also, for those counties that are on the border of the states, border Nebraska or Oklahoma or Colorado, they may even extend it up into those states. Of course, there's some in northern Kansas that maybe use the auction market sometimes in Nebraska, if you will, if that's closer to them. So I think it just depends on where you're located, how many auction markets are near you, and then they'll probably go out at least a little bit further than that just to make sure they encompass as broad a radius as they can.
Are there any livestock insurance policies for theft that producers should consider investing in?
There is some insurance for livestock, and I think that just depends on the producer and how he feels, if it's valuable. I wouldn't say that livestock theft is so broad that it's happening, multiple times a day or things like that. But of course, if you're a producer that's had livestock stolen, it hits you right where you live, right? And so I think there are some options out there that producers can look at. And it would be up to them to determine whether an insurance policy would be viable or not.
Scarlett, wrapping up our discussion with how can cattle producers help each other when it comes to stolen livestock?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to, number one, being observant. If you can, know who also is supposed to be on and off your neighbors' pastures and ranches. And just help keep an eye out in your general area, not just for your stuff, but also for your neighbors. And then also, of course, if you have other livestock that have come onto your ranch, they're not yours, check with your neighbors to see if maybe they've got them out. Just work together on that, because that's the most important thing. Your neighbors are your neighbors, and you want to work with them as best as possible.
That was Scarlett Madinger, Vice President of Communications at the Kansas Livestock Association, talking about livestock theft. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we're taking a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stay tuned in because we'll be back with more up ahead.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Fall is generally considered the best time to plant trees in Kansas. However, spring is a great time for providing care to trees in the home landscape, focusing primarily on pruning and general maintenance. Last week, K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist Cynthia Domenghini discussed evaluating storm-damaged trees to determine whether it should be salvaged or replaced, as well as the need to remove tree suckers that develop within several inches to feet from the trunk of trees. This week, she covers mulching around young trees and the need to provide water to all trees this spring and summer, especially during periods of little to no rainfall. Cynthia says that horticulturists are big fans of using mulch around trees.
Yes, we are huge proponents of mulching. And mulching, as many of you already know, it provides a number of benefits. One of them being it helps retain moisture in the soil. And as we get into summer, and I've already been seeing predictions of drought later in the summer, retaining that moisture is more and more important. As trees are expensive, they're expensive to purchase when they're small, they're more expensive to purchase large ones, but they're also expensive to raise from that small size up into beautiful mature trees. And losing one of those trees to drought is really unfortunate. So start off when you plant your trees by putting a mulch ring around it. And what that is a layer 2 to 4 inches of an organic mulch like bark, and put it down so that it covers the entire area beneath the canopy of the tree. So the canopy is as far as the branches reach out. You want to leave a space, though, away from the trunk. So about 2 to 4 inches or so away from the trunk is where you'll start that mulch ring. And the reason you don't want the mulch right up next to the trunk, there's a couple reasons, but one of the reasons that you want to have a mulch ring that distance around the tree is so that grass and weeds are not growing right up next to the trunk, and you're not having to use your maintenance equipment, your mower and your weed whacker, right up next to the tree. So it helps protect your tree from being damaged from those tools.
We also want to make sure that we're getting the proper amount of water. As you mentioned, it could be dry, and we need to make sure that the tree is staying healthy.
Exactly. Monitoring your trees regularly for their water needs, that goes on for a few years after planting them. Sometimes people think, well, that tree is 5 years old. I don't need to water it anymore. Well, we do need to consider how dry the soil is getting. We do go for long stretches of time without having any precipitation sometimes during the summer, and supplemental water may be necessary during those times. So we definitely need to be monitoring the health of our trees throughout the growing season.
Trying to avoid that stress, because that's when we start seeing disease concerns.
Absolutely. There are diseases, there are insect pests like borers that are going to take advantage of those trees that are already stressed, and the trees aren't able to combat them as well as they would if they were healthy. So we need to make sure we're keeping those trees in their optimal state as much as possible.
Like you mentioned, they really are an investment in your home landscape.
Absolutely. Trees add value to the homes. They provide us with shade. They're beautiful to look at. It's really important to be taking care of them.
That's Cynthia Domenghini, a K-State instructor and horticulture extension specialist, with information on mulching around trees and making sure they have adequate moisture this spring and summer to keep them healthy heading into fall. More information on tree care is available at all county and district extension offices and in the April 29th horticulture newsletter from the K-State Department of Horticulture and Natural Resources. Simply go to hnr.k-state.edu, click on the Extension tab, and then select Horticulture Resource Center from the drop-down menu. That's where you'll find the current and past issues of the Horticulture Newsletter, hnr.k-state.edu. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.